Hello and welcome back to the Our Gifted Kids podcast. I'm incredibly excited to be starting a new season. And we're going to start off with continuing our conversation about ADHD. I'm delighted today to be introducing Meghann Birks, who is actually, in full disclosure, a coach that I have been working with for some time. Meghann and I get deep into all things ADHD as two individuals who have been diagnosed late in life with ADHD. We talk about our lived experience, being diagnosed as adults. We talk about parenting, reparenting, the challenges, the strengths, like we go there. I really hope that you love this episode. It was so much fun doing this with Meghann. She's just such a wealth of energy and knowledge and wisdom. And she's an amazing person to have as your personal cheerleader in your corner, cheering you on, or alternately telling you to cancel everything and go back to bed, whatever is required. We have had a bit of a break in between seasons, and it was slightly longer than I had anticipated, to be perfectly honest, because quite frankly, life happened. And there's just been a lot going on, and also like an enormous amount going on with our gifted kids behind the scene. I have recorded so many podcasts that are ready to go. A, a bunch of amazing authors, podcasts about boys, more podcasts about ADHD. Like there's just a wealth of content. And for anyone who's just like, Sophia, I don't want to wait. Like I just want it all now. When I record the podcasts, I release the video like within a day or two in the Our Gifted Kids membership hub. It's one of the perks of being a member and supporting the podcast in that way is you actually get the access to those podcasts as a video as they're being recorded. We've also been really busy in the community. We meet monthly online. We regularly have guests. We're actually doing a big deep dive into screen time at the moment. And so if you are loving the podcast and looking for more, perhaps that's something to consider. And there are links in the show notes to find out more about the Our Gifted Kids community. We've also got the Unpacking Gifted course up on the website, and it's a great resource if you're just still in that phase of, what is giftedness and what is going on, and just looking for a deep dive into all things giftedness. We have got a cracking few months coming up. I feel like the slide toward Christmas has already begun. And we've also got some great plans for Christmas this year as well. We're going to revisit our ebook from last year, and I'm really hoping to do the Zoom online kind of webinar thing all about Christmas later in the year. But that's enough from me for now. Welcome back. I'm very excited to be starting a new season. I'm loving that we get to start that today with Meghann and talk more about ADHD and giftedness. Podcasts coming up are going to be wild and varied. I cannot wait to get stuck into it. If you love the podcast, feel free to leave us a review and find out more ways that you can support our gifted kids or join in and get a little more involved in the show notes. Talk to you soon. Stay quirky. I hope you love the episode. Hi, I'm Sophia Elliott. As a parent of 3 gifted kids, I'm here to talk about all things gifted. Because I've been isolated and uncertain, and I felt like that parent, then I found peace of mind, support, and my community. This podcast is about sharing that journey, actually parenting gifted kids, and connecting with advice and support. So we have everything we need for every member of our family to thrive. This is the Our Gifted Kid podcast. I'm very excited today to be welcoming Meghann Birks to the podcast. Meghann, all right, full disclosure, is and has been for a little while now my coach. I don't know whether to call you life coach, ADHD coach, but I guess for me, it's just definitely getting through the nitty-gritty day-to-day. Oh my God, I'm help coach. Meghann, welcome.
Thank you. I like that. That's my new title now, the Oh My God Help Coach.
Yeah,
I love
absolutely.
it.
So I'm really excited to have you here today because I am wanting to do this series of podcasts looking at ADHD but also, just what I love and what you certainly bring to my life is a real grounded understanding of just how helping us do life from that neurodivergent perspective, and with that very firm acknowledgement of the world is not designed for us,
Nope.
and it doesn't fit, and how can we take all that wonderfulness about what we have to offer into the world. So welcome, super excited that you're here. Let's
Thank
start
you.
off with, how did you get into coaching and how did you come across the whole gifted thing?
So I got into life coaching, which is a term that I generally steer away from because I think, unfortunately, it has quite negative connotations. There's a bit of a guru-ness attached to it. I know certainly when I started life coaching, which I think I was about 25 when I did the course, which, I knew everything about life at 25, which is
Don't we
hilarious.
all? Don't we all? Absolutely. Yeah.
I was sorted, which I just look back on now. And I actually remember I borrowed the money from the course from my uncle at the time. And I remember telling him what I was doing. And he was like, life coaching, like, you haven't even lived your life yet. Like, how are you supposed to help people? But I had had a really positive interaction with a coach. I was living in South Korea at the time and really needed some help. And there was no English speaking therapist or psychologist, which is what I was really looking for. And so I got hooked up with this coach and she really kind of blew open my life. And she was quite tough. She would call me on my BS and it was
Mhm, mhm.
exactly what I needed. And so my life transformed really quickly, which is kind of then how I got into it. Obviously, it was quite a new industry at that time. The coaching industry has since boomed all over the world. And then niching down into ADHD coaching has happened really organically for me. It has very much been a process of interacting online and in person and on podcasts as who I am, speaking as who I am, claiming my neurodivergency and speaking to that. And then the people who need me have found me.
Mm.
And what I have found, certainly over the last 12 months, is that half my clients seek me out because they are diagnosed with ADHD and they want an ADHD coach or somebody with lived experience of it. And the other half come to me and find out during the process of coaching that they probably do have ADHD, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah.
So I'm attracting a lot of these women. And the gifted piece really comes in because the main problem, and I'm using air quotes for anyone who's just listening to the audio because it's not necessarily a problem. The issue, I guess, a lot of my clients come with is there are so many things I could do. I could be good at any of them, all of
Mhm.
them. How do I choose?
Oh god, yes.
Yes. And
Hallelujah to that one.
yeah, and this is it. And as you've heard me say, and I've said to people, great work this week. Please don't go sign up to do a PhD. Like, just leave it. Let's just enjoy the space that we have created.
Yeah.
And so then in the gifted space, which is where your work is so important because people think gifted and we think of gifted as this quite positive thing. And it is. But it presents, especially when coupled with a neurodivergency, a whole new set of challenges. And there can be this real mismatch between our capability and our energy and our passion and our desire and the fact that we are so overwhelmed by, like you said, that day to day, oh my God, help. How do I structure my routine? How do I make sure I'm eating? How do I make sure I'm drinking enough water? How do I get sleep? How do I do all of those things that we need to do to build our capacity to match all of those things?
Yeah.
And then when I did so last year or during the pandemic, I guess it was the year before, I did a certificate in somatic trauma therapy as well, because that was another layer that was really important for me to add to my practice when working one on one with people. Because as we all, well, I shouldn't say we all know, because a lot of people aren't aware, but when it comes to ADHD, there's a lot of layers that we're dealing with. So we have a genetic component where we have a high heritability. There's a trauma component. So Gabor Mate's work, certainly Scattered Minds, dives into that. We have an environmental component where there are people who may not meet the diagnostic clinical criteria, but are living in an environment where they have symptoms of ADHD. For women, especially, and men as well, but especially women, we have a hormonal component.
Oh,
And then,
yay.
there's a chronic illness component on top of that. So, anyone who's dealing with an autoimmune condition, long COVID, a viral load of any kind, they don't know quite yet what that correlation is. But those symptoms of things that last for a long time, like brain fog and fatigue, certainly exacerbate some of the challenges that we see with ADHD. So that's a very long answer into how I got into coaching people. But the reason that I love it is because it's a blend of the macro. Who are you? What do you want out of life? Who do you want to be in this world? And the really micro, like, what are the daily habits that we need to start building and layering to help you achieve these things?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And so my next question is, so what does ADHD mean to you? And you sort of, I guess, touched on that a little bit, but yeah.
So, in my personal experience
Mm.
of ADHD, I would have the combined type. Now, one of the reasons that, I wasn't diagnosed until I was 38, people had joked about it my whole life. That was no one's great surprise when I sought and received an official diagnosis. Certainly had the hyperactivity as a kid, but also was really able to focus in school. So I always did really well academically. And looking back on it, one of my kids said to me the other day, "Did you like school?" And I said, "I loved the school part of school. The social part of school was a struggle." It was a
Mm,
challenge, especially in junior high. There was a lot of fear there. There was bullying, all of those kinds of things. And I also think that as I approached those years as a teen, that's when I stopped moving as much, which is a really important way that I manage my ADHD now.
mhm,
So, ADHD to me, I guess the first thing that I would say is that it's completely different for every person I've ever met because there are so many different factors. If you have children whose schedules you also need to manage and you're suddenly managing, I've seen your calendar, you've seen my calendar.
yeah.
We're managing 5 people's schedules.
Yeah.
That's a hugely different thing from when I was alone and I managed my
Mm,
schedule and could do what I want
yeah.
and, kind of create space for what I needed in that moment. But what I see mostly, I guess, in my clients, the kind of the top issues that they're dealing with. So one is feeling really overwhelmed by what's considered to be a normal amount of information. So just in terms of group chats, the emails that they're getting through work from their kids' school, from partners, from friends, from family, notifications on social media. Now, I would challenge the notion that that is a normal amount of
Yeah,
information for
definitely.
anybody, and the research would back me on that. We are
Yeah.
not meant to receive the sheer volume of communication. For parents who are also managing the care for a child who is neurodivergent, you add into that their appointments, the invoices, the NDIS, all of that
Mhm,
kind of stuff, and you've got this whole other layer. But feeling really overwhelmed would be one. The dopamine seeking behavior through habits that we know are not good for us. So, for a lot of my clients, that's drugs and alcohol. And when I say drugs, that could be coffee, could be cigarettes, sugar, wine, including harder drugs as well. Gambling or playing online games is a huge one for people. Social media is a massive, getting that little dopamine hit every time you like something or you see a notification that someone shared something you've posted. And where that really becomes a problem is that you see people staying up really late at night, things like that. And the reality of it is when you're sucked into that world and then you're asked to draw your attention somewhere else, that switching between tasks can be really hard for us. And then the impulsivity would be the last one that I see the most. And that's where I work with mostly women, I do work with some men as well, but mostly women who are incredibly brilliant, top of their field, and they have not finished anything in their life. They've got 4 degrees that they've half started and 6 books that are half written, and there's this and there's that. In some ways, that's fine. Like if you start a book and then halfway through, you're like, I don't really want to do this anymore. Okay, great, fine. But when it comes to the consistency that we need to take care of ourselves, that's something that we need to build as a skill and a strategy. And I think where coaching is really important there is that, and many of your listeners who are neurodivergent will identify with this. I think it will resonate with them. You're online, you see the ADHD planning guide to help you finally color code and organize your life, and you buy it and you use it for 2 weeks and you think, well, my life didn't suddenly get easier in 14 days, and you quit and you buy another one, and you buy another one, and you
Yeah.
buy another one. So where a coach comes in is to say to someone, okay, well, we've only been trying this for 3 weeks. Let's give it another week.
Mhm.
Let's give it another 2 weeks. Let's give it another 3 weeks. Because that time blindness that comes with ADHD of, oh, I've been doing this forever. I've been increasing my protein for No, you haven't. You started eating protein 3 weeks ago. Let's give it a chance to boost some of that dopamine and serotonin. And so that's where the coaching process is very much often pulling people back and asking them to just wait. And the reason that I can do that with compassion is because I'm constantly having to pull myself back and say, just wait. And so I understand that struggle, and I know how that feels in the body. It doesn't feel very nice, you know?
Mhm. Yeah, definitely, definitely.
Love what you're learning from the Our Gifted Kids podcast? Why not become a supporter? The quickest way to do this is to leave a review. There's no need for an essay, 5 stars will do. You can also say thanks with a one-off tip in the tip jar, or become a regular supporter for as little as the price of a coffee per month. There are lots of different ways you can say thanks. Check out the link in the show notes or head to www.ourgiftedkids.com to find out how you can help.
Okay, so much in that. Firstly, yeah, ADHD, I love that you said it's different for everyone
Mm,
because, and I think that's a real barrier to people understanding that, you know, they are ADHD. I prefer the person first language, but it's really hard with ADHD
mm,
because it's like it doesn't quite work. So I'm always like, yeah, that sort of language component. So, I don't feel like I have ADHD. I feel like I am ADHD, like it's a part
yeah.
of my brain, but the word doesn't quite work. So I always fumble over it. So it's I think I've talked about this before, but I I was diagnosed with ADHD last year, sort of the second half of last year, which having come after what was quite a big, probably understatement of the decade, quite a tumultuous journey of, first of all, reconciling my autistic self and getting that diagnosis. Nonetheless, it was actually ADHD that started me on that journey and then
Mm,
kind of also came in at the end to finally get that diagnosis. I I remember being at a friend's house for a play date. So we're there with the kids, we're playing board games, and I pick up this book and I actually found it. I'm like, where is that book? It's the anyone who's not sort of seeing the video, it's the ADD friendly ways to organize your life. And I picked it up thinking, oh, I'll just, out of pure interest, I'll have a little flick through this from a purely sort of cerebral approach
mm,
and have a little flick. And I am like 3 pages in and it triggers me and I start having an absolute meltdown at this other person's house at a play date. I'm like, no, stop, pull it together, put I very carefully put the book back on the shelf. Like took a deep breath, pulled myself back together and slowly walked away. I'm like, just breathe, just breathe. I don't know what just happened then, but that was something. And, and this percolated, and a few days later, I think or a little while later, I mentioned to, like, my husband, I'm like, I think I have ADHD." And he's like, "Think so, but, get it checked out, if you're kind of feeling that way." And for a while, that kind of put a lid on it, and there was kind of that sharing of something quite deep, because I've come to learn, am a very big internalizer of all these things. So, like you were saying earlier, it was not a surprise to your friends and family when you got your diagnosis, it'd been joked about. Well, for me, there was like no one would ever have guessed I was autistic. No one would ever have guessed I was ADHD. It's very much an internalized presentation. And so it was a shock to me as well, going through
Yeah.
that process. And I think what I have learnt is, because it's so different for everyone, and I've subsequently said this to friends and family, it's like you need to be motivated enough to go down that rabbit hole, do some reading, listen to some podcasts, find out other people's life experiences so that you have the opportunity to have those aha moments and recognize that in yourself,
Yeah.
because it can be so different. And because this basically, when I was thinking of ADHD back in the day, it'd be like, oh, well, hyperactive little boys.
Yeah.
It's the stereotype. And like you said, there's inattentive type, there's hyperactive type, and it can look like many different things. And we know that now, but it's still not widespread enough. So, and you touched on some things there, like time blindness is a
Hmm.
huge thing for me. And I instantly recognized that. I'm like, oh my God, yes, my whole life. I'm so bad at just anticipating how long something will take to do.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll do that entire proposal in an hour. Sure. Like,
Yeah.
click, or well, I was thinking this morning, one thing that I really used to procrastinate about, because it would be like, oh my God, it's going to take me forever, is just reconciling my accounts, like on my accounting app, right? And this would build up to such a big thing. I'd put it off and be like, "Oh, I really need to do the baths and really need it." And then I'd sit down and it would take me an hour.
Yeah.
And literally, I would, at the end of that, I remember the first time I sat there and I'm like, that took an hour. I seriously thought that would take me days. Like, I was just kind of shocked,
Yeah.
but again, it's probably not something other people always see, because it's the strategies we build around ourselves.
Yeah.
So and other people would probably say, well, probably more so before I had kids, maybe not the last few years, but prior to the last few years would have said, "Oh, Sophia, well, she's always early. She's always
Yeah.
on time, very
Exactly.
reliable," But it was like, that was the panic and the anxiety in me. I had to be there early. Otherwise, it's the unraveling because of this lack of sense of time blindness and how that works. So I wanted to touch on there a little bit some of those other, and you've mentioned some already, other kind of components of ADHD that people might not realize, because the time blindness thing was like, oh, that's a thing. That was like a complete shock to me. And trying to think of what else was a real, but of course I'm having some brain fog.
Yeah.
So I can't think of it right now. So what are some of the other areas that are very, very ADHD things that really will impact that day-to-day life? And you've obviously touched on some already, but let's dive into that a little bit more.
Yeah. So many people have this experience of that aha moment, and yours was a
Mm.
surprise. Mine was not. But I think so the one I would say comes up a lot for women that they find really like, oh, is when I talk about hyperactivity and they're like, "Mm," and then I'm like, how's your brain?
Yeah.
And they're like,
Yes.
oh.
Yeah.
And I'm like, so there's a difference between physical hyperactivity where you've got someone, I was always a pen tapper. I'm a natural born leg jiggler, as the
Oh,
author Betty
yes.
Ballantysh calls it.
Yeah.
And I was as a child, and I still am now as an adult. I want to be on the move a lot. I need a
Yeah.
lot of movement in my day to feel
Mhm.
calm in my body. but a lot of women don't identify. Again, we have that stereotype of the hyperactive young boy kind of thing, and that's what we picture. That's who we think Bart Simpson essentially is,
Yeah, sure,
the
right, yeah,
avatar for that kind
yeah,
of type. Lisa could have had ADHD as well,
yeah,
and when you
yeah,
look at that kind of thing. So that hyperactivity would be a big one.
mhm,
The chronic disorganization,
mhm,
like the chronic
yeah, yeah,
disorganization. You and I were chatting before the podcast, but the whole
yeah,
like where logically, when I walk in the door, I should hang my handbag on the same hook that I have put by the door to hang my handbag on. My handbag is in the car, it's in the boot of the car, it's on the chair, it's in the lounge, so there's this gap between what I understand
mhm,
and what is actually happening in my
mhm,
life, which is where books and supports can be great, but so many of us have played with these systems of color coding and organization and doing this and doing that, and understanding that there's a challenge there.
yeah,
I can never wash the last bits of cutlery in the sink. Like they're and I just accept that now, you
yeah,
know? So that would be a really big one. I think another one that comes up that I don't necessarily know that people identify as ADHD as much as we see it as something with autism spectrum
mm,
is feeling fatigued from a normal schedule or feeling real physical tiredness from quite mundane tasks. So for me, for example, driving in the car will exhaust me because the volume of information that I have to take in, synthesize, process, and action when driving. Well, you can't turn right on this road between this time and that time. If I have to drive somewhere new in the city,
mm,
I will do a test run. I will leave 4 hours before I have to be there and take a book because of that stress, you know?
yeah,
So
yeah,
that's a really big one. Becoming aware of how our neurodivergencies play out in intimate relationships in particular, I think is very challenging. When you have someone who is ADHD or has an ADHD brain or is an ADHD-er, I agree with you.
yeah, yeah.
Not a way
It's
to kind of,
tricky.
yeah, to use the term there. And we're seeking novelty and excitement, and then you're married to someone who maybe craves routine and consistency and things like that. Navigating those challenges with your partner or with friends or with your children or kind of whoever that is in your
Mhm,
life. The the overwhelm of information in a room, and this is where I think a part of the uptick in diagnosis of ADHD obviously has been better education, better resources, and a broadening of what we think of when we think of ADHD. I also think that post pandemic, there are things that we had never realized how much they were affecting us until we didn't have to deal with them for a couple of years.
yeah, yeah,
So for me being in crowds, I wouldn't have thought that was something that I found really overwhelming and that
mhm,
dysregulated my nervous system. But
mhm,
after having 2 years of not being in a crowd,
mhm,
going back into that environment was like a slap in the face.
yeah,
And something that's really important that you touched on, and this is the work that I do with my clients. So they come in, everybody starts off with the same kind of ADHD characteristics and impact analysis. So we go through a big long list and we talk about, so which ones of these do you identify with? First of all,
mhm,
we prioritize them or we color code them. So these are the ones that I really see affecting me in my day-to-day life. And then what we talk about is what I call compensatory behaviors. So for anyone who's been living with ADHD for most of their life, especially for people who are gifted and people who are running businesses and teaching classes and doing all of these things, we have developed a way to compensate for the challenge that that task presents us. Now, sometimes those compensatory behaviors are great. Sometimes our brain has done a really fantastic job of thinking outside the box. And like for me to leave early when I go somewhere, that's not really a problem. I just take some work with me and I leave earlier and it's fine. But if there is a cost or a consequence to that compensation, that's an area where we need to talk about it. So, for example, for me right now, if I go to a social event, how I compensate for that, because I know it will be overwhelming, is that I schedule in some quiet downtime following that event, and I'm aware of it. I'm aware of how it's affecting me. I take a little break, I go outside, I find a quieter pocket when I'm in the room, whatever it is I need to do. But if the way that you're compensating for that is by avoiding all social situations that you want to be a part of,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that becomes something that you need to work on. And this is where, going back to what I said about it's different for everyone, because some people are like, I'd really rather just not socialize with these people I don't really know that well. Fine.
Mhm.
Do you have to? Why do you want to? Asking
Yeah.
those questions, what's underlying that decision? But coming up with ways like the physical restlessness one is a really big one. For years, I tried to slow myself down and not want to move as much. And I've just reached this point in my life where I'm like, nah, this is who I am. I'm not I'm not abandoning my family. It's cutting into my schedule. It's not physically harming me in any way. It's just how I am.
Yeah.
So I've
Yeah.
accepted it. Whereas I've worked with people who were like ultra runners who were getting up at 2 or 3 in the morning to run before their kids were up and they're sleeping 3 hours a night. And I'm like, whoa, okay, that's not sustainable, you know?
Yeah.
And so what's a challenge for you may not be a challenge for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
And
getting up at 3 a.m. to run, that's not a challenge for me. I don't do that. That's not part of
Yeah,
my world.
I've dealt with that really easily by just not doing that. So,
Yeah.
and so those are some of those things. The other one that I think really for women, a lot of girls and women that I've worked with went, oh, interrupting people
Yeah. Yeah.
when they're,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it's really funny for me as the host of my own podcast now. I have to work at that to listen. And it's not because I think when you interrupt someone, that is perceived as you're not listening, you don't care what I'm saying, you just want to talk about yourself. It's actually totally the opposite. It's that I'm so enthralled by what you're saying that
Yeah.
I want to interact and be part of this conversation. And it's how I build empathy between people is by, oh yeah, me too, me too, me too.
Mhm.
And so that's a big one, especially as a kid. Don't interrupt, don't interrupt. Wait your turn, wait your
Mhm.
turn, wait your
Mhm.
turn, wait
Mhm.
your turn. And the frustration that I would feel.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ugh, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
and still as an adult, it's hard at
Yeah.
times.
Yeah.
But I think where the real awesome sauce is in all of this is that all of these kinds of things that we're talking about, that most of us have internalized as some kind of inherent flaw,
Mhm.
the second you go, okay, that's just how my brain works, we drive this wedge between what we're experiencing and what we're making it mean. So for me to go, oops, I interrupted that person, I don't make that mean I'm a selfish, ignorant jerk who can't listen to people. Like I can let go of that narrative
Yeah.
and actually give myself some space to be like, okay, what's actually happening here? How can I change this? What do I need to be aware of and what can I try instead?
Mhm.
Mm.
Yeah, definitely. It's the internal monologue about and I think it's if before diagnosis, it's that internal monologue you have about yourself and your perceived flaws because you get on some level that you're not adulting or,
Mhm.
operating in the world quite as easily as everyone else seems to, and trying so madly to compensate to varying degrees of success. And it's really interesting, like the interrupting thing, like on the questionnaires, it's like, do you interrupt regularly? It's like, well, no, I don't. But in my head, I'm I am like the dog champing at the bit to chase the ball or the rabbit, but is
Yeah.
leashed, and it's like
Yeah.
internally I'm like, I've got this thought, I'm desperate to interrupt, and I'm really containing myself, but externally, no one's kind of noticing that. And I agree, it's kind of like someone said something and you're like, "Oh, yeah, and yeah, and this is that thing that I wanna share because I've totally disconnected with what you said," and it's not about thoughtlessly interrupting, it's actually about, "Oh, totally gelling with what you're talking
Yes.
about, and here's my experience and this thing that I wanna share." And so it's that idea of the externalized and the internalized, which has been quite the revelation in my life over the last number of years. And also, like you mentioned, the hyperactivity. So for me, I am inattentive. So I have that very internal hyperactivity and, definitely, like you said, with the gifted profile as well, like my brain never stops. And But what I also noticed when I was kind of going through this process was like, I think I was kind of doing this questionnaire and, s- you know, recently I had been kind of workshopping something with someone and they'd come over and we were kind of working on this problem together and I was sort of helping them with something in their business. And then when we were in my home and as we're kind of doing some brainstorming and thinking about this in problem, I noticed that I was doing the dishes, I was tidying the kitchen, I was doing laps around the table, like, the whole
Yeah.
time I was not still, I was fully 100% engaged and thinking, but I was moving the whole time,
Yeah.
and so it's that connection between the movement actually being a part of that fully engaged thinking process,
Mhm.
and yeah, and it's kinda like, "Oh, okay, yeah, maybe I can see a bit of hyperactivity there,"
Yeah.
that kind of presentation. And I think some of the other things that really gelled for me was not finishing things.
Yes.
The dopamine hit, the new shiny, anything. It's like, oh yeah, that's really interesting. I would totally love to dive into that right now because who wouldn't? And really that capacity to complete things, not because I don't want to, but it becomes very difficult. There's lots of distractions and there's like this mountain.
Mhm.
And And while I appear to be very organized to most people, it's what I realize it's the extra effort that goes
Yeah.
into that. And what people don't see is like the pile on my desk and the
Yeah.
pure carnage of my to do, not like list, pile, that kind of thing. And I've also come to reconcile and really work with this idea that if I can't see it, it actually doesn't exist. So once something goes into that pile, it doesn't exist for me anymore, it's and I know we have talked in our kind of conversations about how I can actually work with that and make what I'm doing and actually purely visual and have that where I can see it and then I can, it makes sense to me. So in unpacking, because people often say, well, what's the point? Why bother getting a diagnosis? And these sort of things.
Mm.
It's like, I think the point is, and look, whether it's formal or not, the
Yeah.
point of doing the work to uncover it is to figure out how you work. Now that I know that if
Yeah.
something disappears into a pile, it won't exist for me. If it's really that important, I need to stick it to the wall in front of me.
Yeah.
Like if I really need to see it, I now know I need a visual. I know what works for me. I know have this time blindness barrier, so I put extra work into trying to be real or asking other people or taking notice of how long things actually take.
Mhm.
Still working on that, but yeah, and so it's when you have that information, you're better armed to navigate. And I have to mention as well that the diagnosis allowed me to eventually, it took me a little while, but eventually try taking ADHD medication.
Mhm.
And that doesn't work for everyone, and there are all sorts of different meds. And there's this complexity within that. But for me, that has been an overwhelmingly positive experience. And
Yeah.
I only started that, I think it was in February this year. So it's just been a few months. And there was a settling down process, which has been really interesting. But what I felt that gave me is, like previously I would sit at my desk. I knew I had a ton of things to do. So first of all, overwhelm. And I'm like, okay, I just need to get these 3 things done today. But it felt like I had to climb a mountain before I could do the 3 things.
Yeah.
And it was like that with everything. And so I think I'm exhausted at this point in my life because I have been climbing that mountain for everything I've ever had to do my whole life.
Mhm.
before doing the thing and putting so much energy into being productive and efficient and achieving, and not realizing the incredible cost to my body and
Yeah.
myself of having to climb that mountain every single day over and over again. And
Yep.
when I took the medication, it was like the mountain disappeared.
Yeah.
And the first day I took that, I I took it in the morning. I sat down at my desk. I did stuff, like I did my to-do list, and I was going to get my kids in the afternoon, and it's like a 30-minute drive, and I'm reflecting on my day, and I was like spent half that drive in just tears, realizing that I had like done things. I'd got it done. I didn't have to climb any mountains, and it was that relief of, "Oh my
Mhm.
god, it doesn't have to be that hard," but also the grief of, "Where the hell have you been my whole
Yeah.
life?"
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that is very much the space or the niche that I believe I occupy as an ADHD coach, is working with adults who are coming to terms with their own neurodivergency, generally speaking, as their children go through the process of diagnosis. And we fill in the parent questionnaire and we're sitting there going, oh, I'm an always or a five or like whatever the scaling is,
Yeah. Yeah.
and kind of looking at that and thinking, yep, I'm well within the clinical range for diagnosis of this. And as I've spoken about many times, there's this, "Ashta, oh, this makes so much sense." And there's this relief. And then there's this real sadness
Yeah.
for our little people inside
Oh, yeah.
who were told to sit down and be quiet and sit still and stop moving and this and this and this and this. And
Yeah.
just that constant needing to contain ourselves.
Mhm.
And as women, there's another layer there of having to contain ourselves and being the nice girl, and nice girls do and nice
Mm.
girls don't, and we dress like
Mhm.
this and we cross our legs and we stand up straight and blah blah blah, and we eat this and we don't eat that, and there's all these rules. And so the example that you gave of working with your friend around the table and doing this and doing
Mm.
that, when we think about advocating for our children, so think about this idea that's still very prevalent in schools of whole body listening.
Yeah.
So show me that you're listening, which means you're sitting still and you're making eye contact and you're not fidgeting. Oh, like, and to get your head around the fact that we can advocate for our children, but then so many of us are still rocking up to an office where we're expected to sit in a chair for 8 hours a day. And I understand that I'm speaking from a place of immense privilege, where
Mhm.
I have over years built a private practice that allows me to schedule my day with
Yep.
hiking and surfing and swimming and all the things that I need to do to keep myself balanced so that I can do this kind of work. And I understand that. But that knowledge, seeking a diagnosis, like you said, whether it's formal or not, because diagnosis is expensive.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
the wait list is like 2 years to see anyone, right? Like, I always check. Please don't take my word for that. Don't sit there and be like, "Oh, it's 2 years, never mind." It's a long wait, generally
Mhm.
speaking. But there's no reason, like you said, that you can't start talking to people, following people online, reading books, and doing those kinds of things so that we can advocate for ourselves. And the other thing that you mentioned that is so important is the body cost.
Yeah.
And that is where, because I have training as well as a personal trainer and as a movement coach, and then additional training in embodiment practices, including breath work and things like that, with neurodivergency, so both ASD and then also ADHD, our relationship with our body is tricky
Oh,
because
yes.
it tends to one extreme or the other often. And I swear it can be both of these extremes at once, where either we have become so disembodied because we learned at a really young age that we had to ignore all that internal tension and discomfort,
Yeah, yeah.
right?
Yep.
So I'm
Mhm.
working with women in their 40s and I'm like, "Where do you feel this in your body?" And they're like, "What do you mean? My body, it doesn't even exist. I'm floating around up here as just a head." which is, I still feel that way. For me, being embodied is like throughout the day, I have to find ways to be in my body.
Yeah.
So we've either completely dismissed the body from the conversation because it's such an uncomfortable place to be, or we hyper focus on every somatic, like you get a paper cut and you're like, well, I just am not going to sleep for a week because this paper cut hurts so bad. And that's where
Yeah.
we see this link between ADHD and psychosomatic illness. And psychosomatic is often used as this term to be like, it's a made up illness. That's not what that means. The 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 characteristics of whatever it is that you're experiencing are very real. It's not, you're not pretending to be sick or in pain, you're in pain. But the cause of that may not be physical,
Mhm.
And so finding a balance point in there to start to have that conversation. Because if you are an adult who grew up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s with no discussion, no conversation, no awareness of what neurodivergency was, or very limited, depending on your own experience, the reality of it is that you probably don't know when your nervous system is dysregulated, and you probably don't know when you're stressed. And so a question I always ask people is take 6 big breaths, and they do it. And I say, do you feel dizzy? And they're like, yep. And I'm like, you haven't been breathing. If you're sighing all the time, if you're yawning all the time, you're not getting any oxygen. But we have gotten so used to operating in that rushed physical adrenaline state that we don't know what it feels like to operate any other way.
Mhm.
And so this is where, for me, being diagnosed was a way of honoring myself. It was a way of accepting that part of myself. Do I think people need an official diagnosis? Certainly, it gives you access to certain kinds of treatment, including medication, which, like you said, they're a magic bullet for some people. Some people take them and within a week, they're like, oh my gosh, I have done my to-do list from the last 10 years. And then
Yeah.
I have other clients who are like, I'm not sleeping, I can't
Yeah.
eat, and
Yeah.
they have like any medication,
Yeah, totally different for
right?
everyone.
And
Absolutely. Yep.
and for women, your hormones throughout the month can change
Mm.
significantly, which changes your relationship to dopamine, serotonin, adrenaline, noradrenaline, all of those hormones and chemicals in our body, the catecholamines, all of those things can change how the medication works for you.
Mhm.
So it's a process of trial and error. And this is where I think for anyone who is newly diagnosed or anyone who's listening right now and going, it's making an awful lot of sense. And is bringing up as they're listening, they're bringing up the ADHD characteristic list on their phone while they do something else, and they're making lunches, and they're doing
Yeah.
everything at once, and they're reading it and going, oh, this, having that aha moment or that panic
Mhm.
attack, however
Yeah.
that feels.
Yeah, however that manifests for you, yeah.
Finding someone to support you is really important.
Mm.
And this is where I think coaching at the moment, you know, first of all, therapy versus coaching, the best clients I have, when I say best, I don't mean like the best performing, but the ones who have the greatest results or the greatest success, I think, with coaching are people who either have had therapy or are having therapy at the same time. Therapy deals with what was and
Mhm.
how that influenced our internal narratives. Coaching deals with what is in the moment and how we can shift that and move forward differently. I'm very clear on where I'm in therapy territory and where I need to send someone off to a therapist or a psychologist or someone for certain kinds of exploration and discovery. That's not in my ethical wheelhouse as a coach. But where coaches, I think, are crucial at the moment, especially in Australia, is right now, if you get diagnosed, your GP's like, here's some meds to try. You should
Mm.
get a therapist. Okay, well, the wait list, like people aren't even taking names.
Yeah, oh god, yes, definitely. There's a shortage of
Such a
psychologists and
shortage.
access. Yeah,
Any kind of
absolutely.
mental health support. And this is
Yeah.
where there's a lot of ADHD coaches and they all have different styles. So
Mhm.
ask, for anyone who's looking, ask questions. A question I get a lot is, do you have an ADHD coaching certification? I do not. And the reason that I've chosen not to pursue that is because most of the programs I have looked at take a very cookie cutter approach to here's how the ADHD brain works. Here's how we address these challenges. That works so well for some people, but those people are not my people.
Yeah.
My people are the people who are coming to me and saying, I want help with this day to day. How do I put my damn keys in the same spot every day? What can I do to address that little challenge? I say little, not in a dismissive way. I know it's huge when you've lost your keys every single day of your life, but something quite small. And they want to deal with that bigger issue of how do I start to feel my body?
Mhm.
How do I start to address my emotional impulsivity? How do I start to address the feeling of overwhelm? For me, for example, when I'm in a room with my whole family, it's hard. It's so hard. And
Yeah.
acknowledging that and then having tools and strategies for how to ask. Can we all take turns talking? Mommy's brain can't deal with all the information right now. And I really want to listen to what you're saying, whatever those phrases are. So many of us, so many of your listeners are here because they want to be an advocate for their children,
Mhm.
but you have to advocate for yourself. And I know there's a lot of people rolling their eyes right now and going, yeah, 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 I need to put my air mask on first. But the reality of
Do.
it is you
Yeah.
do. You
You do.
absolutely,
You
like,
just
you
do.
just
You
do,
do.
you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
And if, you know, one of the things that we see, and I think it's a really common misconception about people who are autistic or people with ADHD is that they're not intuitive and they're not bull
Uh,
pucky. Sorry, I
yeah.
almost swore.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're highly intuitive. And
Yeah.
the reason that so many of us are highly intuitive is because we're actually picking up on so much information, including facial cues and body
Mhm.
language and all of these things that a person with a neurotypical brain may not be perceiving in the same way.
Mhm.
And they're picking up on your cues
Mhm.
and your frustration. And without adding another thing to the to-do list of all the people who are listening to this podcast, the reality of it is if we don't start to address some of those things in our own life, then our ability to advocate for and provide a different way of being in this world to our children is going to
Mhm.
be limited in some way because we are modeling to them.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think the modeling thing is something we underestimate so greatly as parents.
Yeah.
And I've said it before, and it's like the biggest parenting breakthroughs I have had have come from me doing the work for on myself. And
Yeah.
it's like my breakthrough becomes the parenting breakthrough. And you can't underestimate the investment in figuring stuff out for yourself because like our kids are like little versions of us. I mean, they're all different. They're their own people, but you can't help but look at your kids and just kind of, there'll be this thing. You'll be like, oh, that's, yeah, you totally get that from me or whatever. And it's like when, when like two of my kids in particular, actually all three of them, very hyperactive, and we get that, and so
Hmm.
we accommodate that. We have these amazing things in the lounge. It's kinda like we're in the middle of dinner. It's like, "Okay, go do 2 run and jumps, and then come join us at the table again." And
Yeah.
it's understanding where they're coming from. It's not like that torture of, "You must sit here and perform," and then all the energy goes into sitting and performing, and you can't possibly engage.
No.
And you get to understand those things when you get to understand those things about yourself. And it's like, if things disappear in a pile for me, well, what is that gonna be like for my kids? Do you know?
Yeah.
Is that a thing for them? And you start to, and then, something will happen, or they'll say something and you'll be like, "Oh," and then you'll be like, "So, sometimes this for me, is that like that for you?" And they're like, "Yeah, okay," or "No." Oh, okay, okay, well, maybe it's different for you, but you can have these conversations and
Yeah.
normalize that we're all different and we express differently. And I think one of the other really important things that, conscious of the time, but I want to touch on is the ADHD strengths. And there's a great book, and I don't know what it is, but I talk about it a lot and I can never remember what the damn thing's called. And I really need to just put it on my desks for these moments. But I will put it in the show notes. It's by Dr. Gail Saltz. And it's something about, no, I can't remember the title, but she looks at all these different neurodivergence and she actually unpacks, yes, the challenges, which are all very real. And even like within giftedness, the challenges, as we know, as parents of gifted kids and gifted ourselves, are all very real, but also what the strengths are. And what was really interesting for me about ADHD is she talks about that, that part of our brain which controls the impulse is not functioning typically, which makes ADHD folk more impulsive. But actually, what that also achieves is the and research shows this, and she talks about it in her book, and it's quite astounding that it's very clear that many of our most creative,
Absolutely.
big C creative individuals are ADHD, and or some other neurodivergence because of the way our brains work. So that
Yeah.
lack of impulse, which might be, make it hard for parenting or make it hard in the classroom, actually means that when we're thinking about things, we don't have the impulse that says, "No, I can't share that. No, that couldn't work. No, no, no," which is the barrier that a typical brain would present. And
Yeah.
so without that impulse, it actually allows that free flowing creativity. And the stats on that are quite phenomenal. So if
They
you
are.
are an ADHD or if you have an ADHD kid, like there is a fundamental strength that can be built upon. And we did a podcast recently with Stephanie Higgs where we actually talked about tangible ways to build that creativity muscle. So, if you're
Mhm.
doing that, those very simple things with individuals whose brain is actually wired to be very creative, you're creating a real strength. And that has
Yeah.
definitely been a strength in my life, and that was also one of the things that I really resonated for me when I was, and my ADHD, is that creativity, and for me, like, I did an undergrad in fine art, so I was, you know, uh, externally creative within that kind of recognized, painting, photography, those kinds of things, but creativity is so much more than that, and what I actually realized when I worked in politics was that what made me good in that role was my creative problem solving, my
Yeah.
creative thinking, my ability
Lateral
to
thinking out of the box.
empathize and look at things from someone else's perspective and solve those problems. And that is very classic ADHD.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just it's a wonderful opportunity as a parent or just for ourselves as people to kind of go, okay, all right, I've always wanted to do XYZ. Go do it.
Yeah.
Go
Yeah.
pick up the guitar, write
Try
a
it.
blog, just whatever
Yeah.
that creative thing is, just go do it. Or just acknowledge within yourself that actually you're a creative thinker or a creative problem solver. And that's a strength that you have. And 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 just that validation that that's also what it offers is, yes, lose the keys, but, oh, can I give you
Exactly.
solution?
Yes.
Can
And
I can I
and this
brainstorm with you? Yeah.
and this is where, and I'm conscious of time too, but I when you think of an entrepreneur
Yeah.
and you think
Classic.
of this kind of holy trifecta of creativity, intuition, and impulsivity
Mm.
and the ability to take risks, because
Yeah.
we like that reward
Yep.
circuit's strong in us.
Yep.
I mean, that's where that plays out. And one of the things I think so incredible for our children is that they actually live in a world where they can create these jobs that play to their strengths. Now,
Yeah.
I'm very mindful, especially when I work with younger people and when I'm doing advocacy in schools, and the ways that we sometimes frame these neurodivergencies as it's your superpower. They're
Yeah.
like, these kids are sitting there going, I do not like, I can't read.
Yeah.
Everyone else can read. This does not feel
Yeah.
like a superpower right now, you dummy.
Yeah.
Like, they're that
Yeah.
that false positivity,
Yeah. There's some that
you
language
know?
I find quite problematic as well. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think that's shifting. I think it's shifting
Yeah.
within our education system. People are becoming aware of, and they're becoming aware of it in the, the
Yeah.
affirmation world, manifestation world,
Yeah.
life
Yeah.
coaching world, and everything else as well. But the reality of it is that finding someone who can support you, whether it is a coach or a therapist or a friend or a book or a podcast or like there's a lot of information out there.
Yeah.
The process after diagnosis is about really maximizing your strengths. So looking at what the gift of this is for you, and then dealing with all the boring, hard stuff in the most efficient way possible.
Yes. Yeah.
Sometimes that's delegating, sometimes that's
Mm,
automating. Some like for me, I used to get stressed about the clothes not getting put away. I'd fold them and then they would just get pulled out of the basket. I don't fold the clothes anymore. Who
yeah.
cares? Who cares
Yeah.
if they're folded? Like my kids' clothes are wrinkly. They're all, like they look wrinkly anyway when they put them on because they're kids.
Totally. Yeah.
That kind of thing. And that gift that you just talked about of giving your children that space to express who they are. And this, reparenting ourselves is really hard. But I think that the flip side of this is that there are things I found challenging as an adult and as a mother that when I started to really understand my brain, the perspective changed. And then there was another layer of perspective shift for me that came when I started to do the work on reparenting myself.
Yeah.
And I have my 10-year-old son is like constantly doing cartwheels and running around. And I used to get quite resentful, especially in public spaces. I'm like, don't run into people, be quiet, all
Mm-mm.
the social norms that we
Yeah.
all feel the pressure of, except at homeschool group. I do not feel the pressure there, which is why it's such a lovely place for us to be. And when I realized, my therapist asked me, what was something you needed as a child that you didn't have? And my answer immediately was, I needed someone who could keep up with me.
Yeah.
And immediately I went, I get to be that for him.
Yeah.
And I can't always physically keep up with him because he is 10 and I am in my mid-40s. However,
Yeah.
I can give
You're
him the
there.
space for that
Yeah.
exuberance to exist.
Yeah.
And there is a huge part of the work that I do, especially with women, which coincides with midlife. And you can talk about it in archetypes and spiritual or science or like whatever lens you want to apply, where a lot of the work that women do in midlife is far from a crisis. It
Mm.
is a reclamation
Mm, mm.
of who we were
Yeah.
before the world stamped it out of us.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, that's like, I have the best job in the world. Because when I get
Mhm.
to sit with someone, will they remember what it was that brought them joy as a child and go through
Mhm.
that sad process of why they don't do it? And then go, oh my God, I can do it now.
Yeah.
I can go pick up the guitar and I can leave the perfectionist to the side. I can just stuff around with it and see what sounds it makes.
Mhm.
That's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful thing for our children to witness as
Mm.
well. Yeah.
Absolutely. Again, what wonderful modeling,
Yeah.
that we're valuable and we are worth doing those things for ourselves. And so
Yeah.
as are they, valuable and worth doing those things for themselves. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's yeah, beautiful. And I just feel like there's space there now. And I don't want to
Yeah.
fill it. You're like, go
Yeah.
and just think on that for a minute. And I was yeah, as we started, I'm like, I could just talk to Megan all day, but we can't. So Megan, tell us, how can people find you? Tell us
Yeah.
about your podcast.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. First of all, I just want to publicly acknowledge how much of a support and a mentor Sophia has been for me as I have started my own podcast and I've been sharing. I hit 700 downloads this morning, which was really exciting.
I'm getting
And
goosebumps.
yeah, I got really
Congratulations.
excited. And I've published 12, like I've stuck with this thing.
You've stuck with it. You're finishing. Woohoo. Go, girl.
And the reason I've stuck with this thing, so my podcast is available on all the major platforms. It is called Sisters in Stoke, and it is a platform for women and those who identify as women to share the stories of what lights them up.
Mhm.
What was the thing you needed that you didn't have? Why are you doing it now? What
Yeah.
challenges or obstacles did you face? So it's really just women who are so 110% in on
Mhm.
who they are.
Yeah.
And I personally have found every one of my guests so inspirational to talk to.
Yeah.
And I've just been so jazzed on life while I talk to them. The best
Mm.
place to find me for coaching information is on Instagram. And that's at Meghann Birks Coaching. I'll get you to put it in the show notes because
I
my
will put
parents chose
all
a
the links in
Celtic
there.
a Celtic Gaelic spelling of my name, which actually came from the Thornbirds, which is funny. And so, yes, pop that into the show notes. And then my website is www.meghannbirks.com. This episode I know is not going out for a little while. I'm headed off overseas, but I do have a wait list and I am accepting people on the wait list for one-on-one coaching. And I work with teens and adults
Awesome. And
and
this
I
will
love
go
it.
out. Yep. This will go out just at the end of your trip. So if you're listening to this, like, send Meghann a message, but wait for her to get back.
Yeah.
Give it a little
I am
break.
back early August and jet lagged for several days after I get
Yeah.
back from many
Absolutely.
days of flying and traveling to Canada.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, and I will have some online courses launching later in the year as well.
I'm super excited about that. And I have to say, I've been thoroughly enjoying the podcast. I managed
You.
to binge a few weeks ago and I've been listening ever since. I think I'm caught up. It was quite funny though. I was in the car yesterday. One of my kids, we were driving to the city from home and traffic. I'm like, this is going to take an hour. I'm like, oh, listen to a podcast. But it was that thing of they weren't feeling well. So I'm like, okay, you can watch, YouTube on the phone, but I also want to I really don't want to listen to the YouTube while I'm driving for an hour. So we ended up swapping. So they were watching YouTube on my phone and I had their device like in my overall top pocket. But because their device had like settings on it,
Oh,
there were a couple of episodes that you've marked as explicit content.
they should all be
And
marked as explicit content. Yeah.
well, just in that it's obviously
Yeah.
some adult themes come up. It's people
Yes.
getting deep, like it's not like
Yeah.
explicit.
It's not for little
It's
ears.
no, it's not for little ears. Yeah. And so, but as I was looking at Spotify to select one, I'm like, there was only a couple that I was able to select. I'm like, well, at least the parent controls are working. That's good. And
Yeah.
I re-listened to a couple and really enjoyed revisiting. I'm like, oh yeah, oh yeah, that, yeah, like really. So I'm thoroughly enjoying the podcast. Definitely check it out. Just great conversations, really interesting people. And definitely get in touch with Meghann if you're thinking you need that, oh my God, help coach. I can certainly vouch for that one. And thank you so much. I've been so excited to have you on the podcast and looking forward to this. And yeah, appreciate your time today. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me. We made it happen. We talked
We
about it
did.
for a while before we actually just did the thing and booked it in.
That's right. We
Here
got
we
there.
are.
We're finished.
And
Yeah.
I am such a huge fan of the work that you're doing. I think it occupies an incredibly important space in our world and in terms of encouraging people to take care of the little ones in their life, but also to take care of themselves. And it's long overdue.
Mm.
And it's a really, really important conversation. And so I'm just really grateful that you're doing it.
Well, thank you very much. It's an absolute privilege for me to have these conversations with so many interesting people and learn so much.
Mm,
And and it's a wonderful journey when you can actually see the fruits of that progression.
yeah.
And I'm really in a space at the moment where I've worked so hard for the last couple of years.
Yeah.
I worked so hard and now I'm kind of things are coming together and it's kind of like, oh, it was totally worth it. It took a while. It was hard, but it was work. I'm here moving things forward. Like we're recording this now. I'm actually right now going to do a quick edit and put the video straight up in the member portal so members can get that sneak peek. They don't have to wait. And I'm like, I'm going to do that right now. Can do it. I've got the space. Look at me
Yeah.
go. So yeah, absolutely. So
Yeah.
thank you very much for being on this journey with me. It's an absolute delight.
Thank you.
Thank you. If you enjoyed this episode and it inspired you in some way, I'd love to hear about your biggest takeaway in the comments. For more episodes, you can subscribe, and to help others find our podcast, please leave a review. You can find show notes and more resources at ourgiftedkids.com. And connect with us on Facebook and Instagram. See you in the same place next week.